Another week, another extreme story relating to extreme music. This all being about the heartbreaking story of NME. For those who are unaware, NME is a black thrash metal band from Tacoma, Washington that formed back in the year 1983. Originally, the band was called Night Prowler, consisting of 5 members. However, a year later in 1984, they would dissolve. Of the 5 members, 2 of them, that being bassist Scott Tinsley and guitarist Kurt Struebing, would rebrand the name and continue on making music with new members, that of course being, as we know of it today, NME. Just in case you were wondering, NME is an abbreviation for No Mental Effort. In the same year of 1984, they would recruit Steve Meyer for drums and Brian Lapiton for vocals and become a 4-piece band. The following year, in 1985, they would put out their debut release, that being a demo titled Machine of War. The overall duration of this demo is roughly around 12 to 13 minutes long. It's played in the style of black metal, more in the sense of that first wave, proto-black metal, whatever you want to call it, that has elements obviously of thrash metal, traditional heavy metal, but also a little bit of a hardcore punk influence is sprinkled in for good measure. Besides the intro track that has an audio sample used, from start to finish, this demo is a bunch of 19-year-old and 20-year-olds coming out swinging with a blaze of aggression, from the vocals that are really rugged and dark, to the guitar solos and riffs on here that are excellent throughout and just face melters, to the percussions that have a little bit of this deep beat flair to it. It feels like it encompasses everything that was of the underground, metal and hardcore scene of the 80s into one little demo. The more you listen to this demo, the more obvious that it is. These guys were clearly inspired by and fans of the UK black metal band Venom, so much so that I would argue NME for their time was basically the American version of Venom. A year later, in 1986, they would hone in on that sound and influence to create one of the most ass-kicking extreme metal albums of the 1980s, that being their debut full-length album, Unholy Death. It's an album that's half an hour long, that's just a melting pot of just ruthless aggression combining first wave black metal, thrash metal, and once again this hardcore punk flair and attitude with everything, that every single song stands shoulder to shoulder with one another, that it's abrasive, it's rugged, in your face all the time, that if you want an adrenaline rush of 1980s primitive extreme metal, you'll find it with this. Even the presentation of this album just screams this primitive DIY aesthetic. From the album artwork, all hand drawn by pencil from the guitarist Kurt Struebing, to the song titles on this album, such as Louder Than Hell and Speed Kills. As goofy as it is for today's standards, it just screams that, primitive, evil 80s sound and aesthetic and presentation that I feel like in retrospect now has a distinct charm to it. My personal favorite track on this album would have to be Descendant Mayhem. The clock's in roughly around 4.5 minutes long. And the standout portion about it is the first half of it that's just guitar being played. But not in the sense to create rhythm, groove, or melody, but more so that it's just creating this massive wall of harsh noise. It's just feedback from that portion that's razor sharp to listen to. That it sounds like to me, the guitar, the instrument of the guitar, is just doing this massive battle cry before it transitions to all the other instruments joining in, like the bass, drums, and vocals, that gets back into the swing of things of that black thrash, hardcore punk being piled on top of everyone. That every little aspect about this album, whether they're playing fast, which is the majority of the album, to just shaking it up with like a build-up, it's just always so incredibly primitive. Looking at this album in terms of historical context, it's really quite significant when you take into factor the whole topic of first wave or proto black metal that a lot of people have interest in when it comes to understanding the origins of black metal itself. And typically when that conversation's brought up, we'll look at bands from Europe such as Venom, Bathory, Sodom, and Hellhammer, or even in South America, more particularly in Brazil, like Sarcófago, Sepultura, Holocausto, and Volcano, to even in Japan, there's Sabbat. Yet when it comes to the USA, no one really brings these guys up, and when you listen to this album and take into factor the influence and the sound that they're presenting, you could argue that NME with Unholy Death is the first ever full-length black metal album released by a USA band. Before I go any further with the story of NME, it's worth mentioning that prior to making this video, there's very limited information about them, from live shows that they did to interviews and behind the scenes stories, as a lot of it has either been never showcased to the public or lost throughout time. An example of it is they used to have a website called nme666.com, which is basically the band's website, but that was taken down some odd years ago, so all of that information is lost. However, luck would be on my side, as last month Hulu would release a documentary series called Into the Void: Life, Death, and Heavy Metal. So far it only has one season and it's done 8 episodes. A majority of them are documentaries on legacy acts such as Randy Rhoads with This Time with Ozzy Osbourne, to Judas Priest, to Death, and Pantera with Dimebag Darrell. But to my utter shock, episode 2, they did a documentary on NME, or more specifically the guitarist of NME, Kurt Struebing. So just know, besides the really significant events that would happen after with NME that's known by the majority of the public that know of this band, all of the other little details that I'll be talking about here, I all gathered from this documentary, which again, you can all watch on Hulu. Even though NME is a 4-piece band, by a lot of people from the documentary, such as friends, family, and other band members, a lot of people point to their guitarist, Kurt Struebing, for being the heart, soul, and muscle behind everything, as he's the main songwriter who wrote lyrics and even did artwork for both the demo and full-length album. While Kurt's upbringing is still a mystery, as all it states online is that he was adopted, thanks to the documentary Into the Void, it paints a little bit bigger of a picture of how his preteen and teenage years were, as it states roughly around when he was starting to get into high school, the age of 14, he started showcasing more interest with like dark media, whether it be him doing his own drawings that were quite dark and mysterious to the music that he was listening to. However, his father was often described by friends and family as being quite neglectful. He was often characterized as being a drunk, showcasing a lot of disinterest for anything that Kurt had interest with. Thus, he really didn't have a healthy relationship or have that parent dynamic that most kids growing up definitely need to have a healthy mindset. As for Kurt's mother, Darlie Struebing, she was the total opposite, showcasing interest with Kurt's hobbies, even buying his first ever guitar, to even jamming out with him listening to Dio's Holy Diver, that in some aspects we can state that a huge reason as to why Kurt got more interested playing metal music is because of his adopted mother. During the mid-1980s, after NME was releasing their demo and then their full-length album Unholy Death, they ended up doing quite a lot of live shows around the Seattle, Washington area, which was quite the hotspot for hardcore punk and heavy metal music, at least in the underground music scene. And considering the fact that NME is a combination of both of those styles, they were basically one of the bands to catch live in Seattle, Washington. It was pretty cool to see actual live raw footage of some of their performances during the 1980s in the documentary, because they're impossible to find on like YouTube or anywhere else. That might be some of the first times it's ever been showcased to the public, some of these live videos. And it even stated that at some of their shows, Kurt would end up playing the guitar with his tongue and mouth so aggressively that he would end up cutting his mouth or tongue and bleeding and spitting the blood all over the place in the crowd, which just showcases how unhinged they were when it came to their performances. Not only was Kurt Struebing dedicated to the musicianship of NME, but also promoting it as well, as during that time in the 1980s, tape trading was an insanely big deal, and the only way to really listen to any band's music was to do stuff as such as tape trading. And what Kurt would end up doing was sending out their demo tapes or tapes of their full-length albums all across the globe, from labels in Europe to music reviewers, to get them more attention. And all the feedback that they would end up getting from either labels or reviewers was highly positive. Which, I mean, can you blame them? When you listen to Unholy Death, it's such an ass-kicking listen that you can't help but indulge yourself in that aggression. And because of all of the positive feedback that they were getting primarily from a lot of European outlets like labels and music reviewers, they were planning on doing a European tour in the summer of 1986. Along with the fact that they were planning on releasing an EP called Rites of Self-Destruction immediately after Unholy Death. It seemed like these guys were steamrolling and sky was the limit for them. Sadly, none of those plans would come into fruition, as any chance they had of a summer European tour wouldn't end up happening, and their EP never materialized, as tragedy would strike the band in spring of 1986. So as the story goes on the accounts of the documentary Into the Void, is that during spring break of 1986, NME would end up playing a house show. And because of it being very open and public, a lot of people coming and going, some of the participants at that house show were in the indulgence of illegal substances. It doesn't say exactly what the substance was that people were taking, other than it was described as it being very cheaply made. Again, not exactly sure, but either way, it clearly had some damaging effects on the people who took it. One of those participants being the guitarist, Kurt Struebing, who people stated, such as friends and band members, that he seemed very unlike himself, from being very friendly and open to being quite hostile and aggressive to people. One thing I need to address to clear the air on here is that prior to watching the documentary, one article that I came across that was posted roughly around 20 years ago describing Kurt Struebing and his, I guess in this particular event, taking substances, is that it stated that he was a substance abuser, he was an addict, that he was, taking drugs daily and weekly almost, when that's overall not the case. As from that article, some of the comments that I read that were from band members and the documentary interviewing friends and family, is that he was never known for, drug addiction or an abuse. It's just, I guess, in that heat of the moment, being in a band, playing a house show and socializing, it was something to spice up, I guess, the buzz of getting a new high. It's just that wouldn't be the case, as it was a cheaply made substance, so it gave him a bad trip. Add to the fact, from a little bit more we know of him with his backstory and upbringing, of him having an abusive, drunk dad essentially that really neglected him. He had more of like this mental illness, so combining a really crappy substance with mental illness of your adolescent upbringing, it didn't really mesh all that well together, and sadly led to an extremely tragic event. That being, shortly after that house show, on April 7th, 1986, Kurt Struebing would end up murdering his own mother. The police would end up investigating after getting a 911 call from Kurt Struebing stating that he murdered his own mother and he was doing it for God's work. And when they arrived to the scene, they found Kurt completely naked, covered in blood. While under custody, Kurt confessed that he murdered his mother with a hatchet and scissors, and stated that his motive for it was he thought he was a robot and that everyone else was a robot, and to prove that to himself, he wanted to open up his own mother. He would end up being sentenced to 12 years in prison for an insanity plea because of mental illness, but he ended up serving 8 years. One thing that was brought to light thanks to the Into the Void documentary is during the beginning of his sentence, it stated that Kurt Struebing tried jumping off of his bunk bed onto the concrete floor to smash his own head in, as a lot of people presumed he was trying to take his own life, after it really started to hit him with the crime that he committed. It's really easy to gather from the friends and family that commented about Kurt and his mother's relationship that prior to this event, they both had a very loving, healthy relationship, as she was always supportive of him and they were always getting along. And again, she would show interest with his hobbies, whether it would be jamming out to Dio's Holy Diver to buying his first ever guitar. Clearly they had a loving, healthy relationship. So it would be completely out of character for Kurt to commit this crime unless something mentally was very wrong with him, thanks to the substance that he partaked in that really altered his mind, and the fact that him trying to take his own life in prison, showcasing that he had a very deep form of regret that was indescribable. As I stated, he was sentenced to prison for second-degree murder for 12 years, as it was under the conditions of mental illness. But he ended up getting out for just serving an 8-year prison sentence and ended up leaving prison in 1994 and immediately started NME right back up. During that same time period, he ended up getting married and becoming a father with a newborn son. Now, during the year 1994, when NME would reform, most of the original band members would rejoin, that being Steve Meyer, the drummer, Scott Tinsley, the bass player. Kurt Struebing would still be performing guitar, but their original vocalist, Brian Lapiton, wouldn't rejoin as he went off the grid, making Kurt Struebing do double duty, performing both vocals and guitar. And a year later, in 1995, after a 9-year slumber, NME would return to the metal scene with their second full-length album, Machine of War. It's titled after their debut demo, Machine of War, that they did in 1985, as it contains re-recordings of the tracks from that demo. That being said, considering the fact that NME has been really out of the scene for almost a decade, and the overall metal scene has evolved during that time from the 80s into the 90s, the overall approach from this full-length album is pretty different from their debut full-length. As the debut full-length album, Unholy Death, was a mixture between black, thrash, hardcore punk that was really raw and primitive, Machine of War is more concentrated now on thrash metal. The black metal elements is completely evaporated in favor of more crossover types of influences on here. In terms of guitar riffs, this album is a lot more groove oriented, and because of that structure, it allows for choruses to be a bit more distinguishable from the previous album especially. Add to the fact when it comes to the vocal performance here by Kurt, it's quite different from their original vocalist, Brian. As Brian had that rugged, dark, morbid yell, Kurt's is a lot more aggressive, in-your-face, and loud, as more of a shout in terms of its execution that favors more of that crossover thrash approach. My personal favorite song on here would have to be The Floor of the Sky. That really straightforward, great riffs, really catchy, with a killer guitar solo to cap it off. The only thing about this album I really didn't care for is that while Kurt's vocal approach when it comes to the yelling and shouting is executed well for this approach, it's just some of the opening tracks on this album, he does this spoken word bits in between some of the yelling and shouting that when it melds together, it's kind of awkward, but really that's the only thing negative I could criticize about this album. Other than that, the only other thing to bring up with this album is the closing track. They did a cover of AC/DC's Let There Be Rock, which is extremely cheeky and just lowbrow fun to listen to. That, I don't know, I really like it when extreme metal bands can do covers of, like, you know, big rock anthems and still have fun with it. With that all being said, it's a no-brainer that Unholy Death overshadows this album by a lot, but definitely check it out if you're a fan of thrash metal, I would state, because during the 90s, thrash metal was during like this awkward period where a lot of people state that this particular subgenre didn't have much going for it, and while this isn't breaking any new grounds, it's still a very fun listen that's executed pretty well for the most part. Other than that, it's quite obvious that, considering the fact that NME being out of the metal scene for almost a decade, add to the fact that they're kind of like falling behind with what metal's doing during this point, they really didn't get a lot of attention with this release, and they would end up remaining silent for 7 years after. Plus, I'm going to go on an educated guess here, considering the fact that Kurt and company are like now actual adults now with a job and a family to take care of. The band NME really isn't their main priority as much. It wouldn't be until 2002 where NME would release their third and still to this day latest full-length album, Vermination. At face value, it's kind of hard to call this a full-length album, because even though it contains 8 tracks, the overall runtime for it is just shy above 20 minutes long. So even though it's categorized as a full-length, to me personally, this is just an EP with a lot of tracks. There really isn't much to say here other than it's just a really enjoyable release, because it's still in the same vein as Machine of War, of that crossover thrash metal with, again, no like black metal elements unlike Unholy Death. It's just the difference here is that it just cuts to the chase. There's no spoken word parts that I criticize for it being kind of, again, awkward with Machine of War. It's just shouting, yelling, aggression from start to finish for 20 minutes. I mean, all I can really state here is that if you enjoy Machine of War and you want more of that approach from this band, then Vermination is that. Even though NME is getting nowhere as much attention or critical acclaim as they were when they were younger, when they started out in the 80s when releasing Unholy Death, I really do admire the fact that Kurt Struebing is still continuing on with the band, showcasing that he still has a desire, passion, and fire burning within him, not only to create music, but just to keep this project alive and afloat. So much so that a few years later in 2004, he would end up collaborating with the Japanese black thrash band Abigail, doing some covers of NME with their release called Fucking Louder Than Hell, which is a clear homage to NME with the song Louder Than Hell. While it's great to see that Kurt remained active with the band NME and his own personal life as a father and husband, to address the elephant in the room as everyone was being interviewed about him getting out of jail, as again, he still was in prison for committing murder, a lot of people were asked the questions as to how they felt about him. And all of the answers that were given from the family and friends is that they all felt comfortable around him. While he never really talked about it per se, other than one time with his wife showcasing remorse for it, it seemed as if he would remain active with his son, whether it was just jamming out with him, to playing in the band NME and releasing music, just to keep himself occupied to kind of cope with what he had committed. But overall, when he got out of prison, he remained a very functional, healthy person around friends and family. The real big red flag that was raised, however, is the whole time that he got out of prison, never once did he go seek help by, going to therapy or getting medicated for anything that had to do with his mental health after the psychotic breakdown that he had in 1986. And I do feel like because of that not being treated in any sense the whole time that he was released, his demons finally caught up with him. Because on March 9th, 2005, tragedy would strike NME once again. As the story goes, Kurt would end up leaving work early, taking a different route to his house. That different route consisting of him going over a swing bridge. Now, when that swing bridge was being used, barricades would have been lifted up to stop any incoming traffic. However, as eyewitness reports stated, when he stopped his car, he then sprung out of nowhere, gunning it full force into the barricades, breaking through, and then plummeting to his death, falling over 50 feet. Some individuals presumed that he had been intoxicated and this was an incident of drunk driving. However, as more eyewitness reports came through that they saw him fully stop, then immediately gun it through the barricades, that he had more of a death wish of a mindset. And when you take into consideration his backstory with the band, his adolescence, and the events that happened decades prior, to a lot of his friends and family, they view it that all of his demons finally caught up with him and that he took his own life. Kurt was 39 years old, leaving behind a wife and a son. Not like you need to hear it from me, but it's an insanely heartbreaking story when you look at everything. And trying my best to do this in a narrative sense without it being degrading, I understand that to some people with what happened with Kurt decades ago with his mother, that it's hard to look past that, which I understand just looking at this story briefly. But from all the reports that I came across relating to either his family and friends that knew him personally, it was nothing but just positive, loving remarks about him, that he wanted to move on with his life. And yeah, maybe a big mistake by him is that he never addressed it, he never saw counseling, he never got any kind of like mental health type of checkups. You know, we can go on and speculate what he did wrong there on that. But I do believe that the incidences that led to that event was not something that he wanted. I really don't think he had this intent of doing that willingly unless there was something deeply wrong with him. So I do believe, just again, from just the consistent positivity from friends and family, he was a caring person. It's just in this case, you know, again, he never addressed his demons and they finally caught up with him. The last bit of information that I can tell you about NME is a few years after, in 2007, Abigail would end up releasing a tribute album called Abigail's Tribute to NME, as it contains all cover songs of NME by Abigail. And still to this day, NME is active apparently, as back in 2024, only a year ago, they ended up releasing an EP called As Discussed, where it's not really them playing any form of metal per se, but it's more in vein now of this very grainy noise rock approach that I really wouldn't say is for people who enjoyed their previous material, but it's just worth mentioning that the band, even absent with Kurt's influence, is still going. As for my closing remarks towards NME, I gotta state, out of all the stories that I have covered or will cover in the future, this is easily the most heartbreaking story for a band. Not just having to do with Kurt Struebing and all of the dark, twisted, and tragic events that he went through, but again, the band themselves, you know, for my personal standards, they are the first black metal band from the United States. In terms of recognition and influence, they should be up there among the ranks with like Bathory, Venom, or Sarcophago, and etc., but they're not. And they're just viewed as this obscure name that really doesn't get much attention because of all the setbacks they went through. As they started off really strong in the 80s with Unholy Death, and they never got the gears turning to gain more momentum and more recognition, as they never toured outside of their home state. As all the things that happened with Kurt and the murder, they had to disband. For them trying again in the 90s and even putting a valiant effort within that approach to thrash metal, but they were basically out of the loop with what was happening with extreme metal during that time, that they didn't get much recognition. To even in the early 2000s when they tried a third time, yeah, it's a valiant effort, but still no one really paid that much attention to them. To a few years after, they go through a second tragic event with Kurt taking his own life, which is unheard of. That it's bad enough that one tragic event happens for a band, but two for one band is just insane, and I can't imagine going through that again. That, you know, I do feel bad for them. I really do feel like even though their prime was almost 40 years ago, I truly do feel like the best we can do is at least admire the music that they left for us. Again, Unholy Death is an absolute face melter of an album. I feel like anyone who is a fan of extreme metal that just likes that primitive, raw, aggressive sound, you will find it with this album, and it absolutely deserves to be cherished and admired all these years later. That I absolutely believe they deserve any little bit of recognition all these years later, in my personal view. But yeah, as I stated, this is easily like the most heartbreaking story I've seen a band go through. And even though they're still active to this day and they've changed it up quite a bit, you know, I honestly commemorate them for just still being a thing after all of this time and all of the events they went through. I give them nothing but my respect. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, everything I talked about will be linked down below in the description. Really curious to know what your thoughts are on this. And like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.